An elderly woman faced rejection and scorn over a simple withdrawal, but when Keanu Reeves walked through the door, the bank staff froze, and everything changed. Margaret Thompson walked into the First National Bank on a Tuesday morning, her steps slow but deliberate. She carried a small cloth purse, its edges frayed from years of use, and clutched it tightly against her chest. At 78 years old, she didn't visit the bank often, only when absolutely necessary. Today was one of those days. She needed to withdraw $200 from her savings account to cover her monthly rent, a task she'd done countless times before without issue. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee, and the hum of voices filled the air as customers moved through the lines. Margaret approached the counter, where a young teller named Jessica stood behind the glass. Jessica's badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and her expression remained neutral as Margaret slid her withdrawal slip across the counter. Margaret explained that she needed the money in cash, offering a polite smile as she spoke. Jessica glanced at the slip, then at Margaret, her brow furrowing slightly. She asked Margaret for her identification, which wasn't unusual. Margaret fumbled with her purse, pulling out her driver's license, expired now for over a decade since she no longer drove, and handed it over. Jessica examined the license, her fingers tapping lightly on the counter. She told Margaret that the ID was no longer valid and that bank policy required current identification for transactions. Margaret blinked, caught off guard. She explained that she had been a customer here for over 30 years and had never needed anything more than this license. Her voice stayed calm, though a slight tremor crept in as she spoke. Jessica shook her head, repeating the policy line, her tone growing clipped. She suggested Margaret return with a valid ID, like a passport or a state-issued card. Margaret's shoulders sagged. She didn't have a passport, never needed one, and getting a new ID would mean a trip to the DMV, a process she wasn't sure she could manage alone. She asked if there was another way. Perhaps if Jessica could check her account history to verify her identity. Jessica sighed, loud enough for Margaret to hear, and said she'd need to speak to a manager. She turned away from the counter, leaving Margaret standing there, her hands resting on the edge of her purse. A few customers in line behind Margaret shifted their weight, some muttering under their breath. One man checked his watch and exhaled sharply. Margaret felt their eyes on her, her cheeks warming with embarrassment. She hadn't meant to hold anyone up. She just needed her money. Minutes passed, 5, then 10, before Jessica returned with a manager, a middle-aged man named Robert whose tie sat slightly askew. Robert carried a tablet and barely looked up as he approached. Robert asked Margaret to repeat her request, his tone brisk. She did, her voice softer now, explaining the expired ID and her long history with the bank. Robert tapped on his tablet, pulling up her account, and confirmed that she was indeed a customer. But he echoed Jessica's stance. Policy was policy. Without valid ID, they couldn't process the withdrawal. Margaret asked if they could use something else, her social security card maybe, or a utility bill with her name on it. She had those at home. Robert shook his head, saying those weren't acceptable under their guidelines. Margaret's frustration bubbled up. She told Robert that this was ridiculous, that she'd never had trouble before. Her voice rose slightly, drawing more attention from the people around her. Jessica crossed her arms, and Robert's jaw tightened. He told Margaret that raising her voice wouldn't change the rules and suggested she lower her tone. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped her purse tighter. She wasn't yelling, she said, just trying to understand why they couldn't help her. The exchange grew tense. Robert warned Margaret that if she couldn't comply, she'd need to leave the premises. A security guard nearby, a broad-shouldered man named Tom, shifted his stance, watching the situation unfold. Margaret's eyes welled up. Though she fought to keep the tears back, she asked how she was supposed to pay her rent if they wouldn't give her access to her own money. Robert didn't answer, just repeated that she needed proper ID. Jessica smirked faintly, turning to help the next customer as if Margaret no longer existed. Margaret stood there, frozen, humiliation washing over her. The people in line stared openly now, some whispering to each other. She felt small, insignificant, like a child scolded in front of a crowd. She turned to leave, her steps unsteady, when a voice cut through the murmur of the lobby. It was deep, calm, and carried an authority that made everyone pause. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" the voice asked. Margaret stopped, glancing over her shoulder. A man stepped forward from the back of the line, his dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, a black jacket hanging casually over his frame. It was Keanu Reeves. His presence registered slowly with the staff. Jessica's eyes widened, and Robert's tablet nearly slipped from his hands. The customers around him murmured, recognizing him instantly. Keanu approached the counter, his gaze steady but not aggressive. He looked at Margaret first, then at Robert and Jessica. He asked again more firmly what the problem was. Margaret hesitated, then explained her situation, her expired ID, the bank's refusal, her need for the rent money. Her voice shook as she spoke. But Keanu listened intently, nodding as she finished. He turned to Robert and asked why they couldn't make an exception for a long-time customer. Robert stammered, caught off guard. He repeated the policy about valid identification, his words tumbling out faster now. Keanu raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. He asked if they'd verified Margaret's account, which Robert admitted they had. Keanu pressed further. Didn't that prove she was who she said she was? Robert shifted uncomfortably, saying it wasn't enough under their rules. Jessica stayed silent, her earlier confidence gone. Keanu's tone remained even, but his words carried weight. He told Robert that rules should serve people, not the other way around. He asked how they expected an elderly woman to navigate getting a new ID just to access her own money. The lobby grew quiet, all eyes on the exchange. Robert opened his mouth to respond, but Keanu didn't let him interrupt. He suggested they call Margaret's account references, or use secondary verification methods. Surely a bank this size had options. Margaret watched, stunned, as Keanu took charge. She hadn't expected anyone to step in, let alone someone like him. Robert glanced at Jessica, then back at Keanu, clearly unsure how to proceed. Keanu asked for the branch manager, his voice firm but polite. Robert hesitated, then said he was the manager. Keanu's lips twitched, almost a smile, before he asked for someone higher up, someone who could actually make a decision. Robert excused himself, retreating to the back office, his steps quick. Jessica avoided eye contact, busying herself with papers behind the counter. Keanu turned to Margaret and asked if she was okay. She nodded, though her hands still shook. She thanked him, her voice barely above a whisper. He waved it off, saying no one should be treated like that, especially not over their own money. Minutes later, Robert returned with a woman named Linda, the regional supervisor, who'd been in a meeting upstairs. Linda carried herself with more authority than Robert, her posture straight and her expression composed. She introduced herself to Keanu and Margaret, asking for a rundown of the situation. Margaret started to explain, but Keanu stepped in, summarizing it concisely. Margaret needed her money, the bank had her account details, and the staff refused to help over an expired ID. Linda listened, her face unreadable. She asked Robert why they hadn't used alternative verification, like a phone call to Margaret's listed contacts or a review of her signature history. Robert fumbled, saying it wasn't standard procedure. Linda cut him off, saying standard procedure didn't mean ignoring common sense. She told Jessica to pull up Margaret's account again and instructed Robert to call the secondary contact listed, a neighbor Margaret had known for years. The process moved quickly after that. Jessica confirmed the account details, and Robert made the call, verifying Margaret's identity within minutes. Linda apologized to Margaret directly, saying this should have been resolved sooner. She approved the withdrawal, and Jessica handed over the $200 in cash, her hands trembling slightly as she did. Margaret took the money, tucking it into her purse, her relief palpable. Keanu stayed until it was done, standing quietly by Margaret's side. Linda thanked him for bringing the issue to her attention, and he shrugged, saying it was the right thing to do. Margaret turned to him, her eyes bright with gratitude. She told him he didn't have to do this, that she didn't know how to thank him. He smiled, a small, genuine smile, and said she didn't owe him anything. He just hoped she'd have a better day from here. Margaret left the bank with her money, her dignity restored, though the weight of the earlier humiliation lingered. Keanu followed a moment later, slipping out without fanfare. The staff stood in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. Robert adjusted his tie, avoiding Linda's gaze, while Jessica stared at the counter, her smirk long gone. The customers in line buzzed with chatter, some pulling out their phones to share what they'd witnessed. Word spread quickly after that. People talked about how an elderly woman had been mistreated, how the bank staff had dug in their heels, and how Keanu Reeves, of all people, had stepped in to set things right. Margaret went home that day, paid her rent, and sat quietly with a cup of tea, replaying the morning in her mind. She didn't know Keanu personally, but she'd never forget what he'd done. The bank, meanwhile, faced questions. Linda launched a review of their policies, spurred by the incident. Robert and Jessica received retraining, their attitudes adjusted by the experience. And Margaret? She kept banking there, though she made sure to get a new ID just in case. Every so often, she'd hear someone mention Keanu's name in passing, and she'd smile to herself, remembering the day he'd turned her worst moment into something else entirely.